Hello. Today I'm going to be talking about some changes to Texas law and updates to some of Texas Realtors and tax forms and contracts. I'm also going to be introducing you to some new forms that Texas Realtors has made available for you to use. Before we get into the specific form and contract changes, I want to briefly explain what led to many of the updates you're going to hear about today. You may already be familiar with Senate Bill 1968, which Truck is often referred to as its housekeeping bill. You may have also heard us here at Texas Realtors call it the agency bill, although the bill addresses much more than just agency. Senate Bill 1968 really modernizes several provisions of the Real Estate License Act, or TRELA, to better reflect current real estate business practices. So when I refer to Senate Bill 1968 or simply the bill, I'm talking about changes to TRELA and other Texas laws that affect real estate. Most of these changes took effect on January 1st, 2026. I'm not going to cover every provision in the bill. Instead, I'll focus on the changes that are most likely to impact your day-to-day business. And I'll break the discussion into two main parts. First, how the bill affects agency relationships, and second, the new written agreement requirement under Texas law. So, one of the most significant changes to agency relationships is the removal of subagency from TRELA. This change took effect on January 1st of this year, and it applies across all areas of real estate. You may be wondering why the legislature made this change. Subagency has long been a source of confusion for both consumers and license holders. So, removing subagency from the statute is intended to ensure that everyone clearly understands who represents whom, as well as the duties and obligations that come with each relationship. And then additionally, other legislative changes that I'm going to discuss today, such as updated disclosures and the new written agreement requirement, have effectively made subagency unnecessary. So let's talk about some of those changes. I want to talk next about a new option for non-agency showings or showings without representation. So Senate Bill 1968 created a very limited carve-out in the law that allows a license holder to show property for sale or lease without representing the prospective buyer or tenant. As of January 1st of this year, if certain conditions are met, and if your broker allows non-agency showings, you may choose to show the property without representing that buyer or tenant. Let's walk through when and how a non-agency showing is permitted. First, this non-representation option is only available when no agency relationship has been established or agreed to before the showing. In other words, the individual is not your client. Under TRELA, 4 conditions must be met for a non-agency showing. As I already mentioned, you have not agreed either orally or in writing to represent the party. Next, you're not acting as the party's agent at the time of the showing. You must also not provide opinions or advice about the property or about real estate transactions in general. And then you do not perform any other acts of real estate brokerage. It's important to emphasize that in a non-agency showing, your role is limited strictly to showing the property. If the person decides they don't like the property, you cannot provide additional brokerage services such as locating other properties or suggesting other listings without representing the party. You may, however, provide basic factual information about the property, such as the number of bedrooms, bathrooms, square footage, and that type of information from the listing. You might also be wondering whether the IABS is still required when performing a non-agency showing, and the answer is yes. The IABS must still be provided at the first substantive communication concerning specific property. I'll be discussing updates to the IABS later in this webinar. And then also keep in mind that a listing broker may still show property without representing the buyer since the broker already represents the seller. I'll talk more about that scenario shortly when we discuss open houses. So next I'm going to move on to the new written agreement requirement. As of January 1st, TRELA now requires license holders to enter into written agreements with prospective buyers of residential property when providing brokerage services. In short, if you're working with a buyer of residential property, you must have a written agreement in place. And this requirement also applies to the non-agency showings that I talked about just a moment ago. So let's walk through the specific requirements of the written buyer agreement. So let's first talk about timing. It's important to understand when the written agreement must be entered into. So as of January 1st, the written agreement must be entered into before you show a buyer a residential property. If you do not show the buyer a property, the agreement must be signed or entered into before you submit an offer on the buyer's behalf. So this might include sight unseen offers or situations where the buyer has already identified the property and they contact you solely to prepare and submit an offer. It's also important to note that this requirement applies only to buyers of residential property. The law does not currently require a written agreement when working with tenants of residential properties or with buyers or tenants of non-residential properties. Next, let's talk about the type of agreement required. The form of agreement you use depends on whether you're acting in an agency or a non-agency capacity. If you are representing the buyer, you must use a buyer representation agreement. This applies if an agency relationship has been established. So, even if you have a verbal agreement or conduct that creates implied agency, you need to use a representation agreement. And in these cases, you must use the buyer representation or enter into a buyer representation agreement before showing property. And then, as I mentioned, if there's no showing, before submitting an offer. Examples of agreements you may use are the Texas Realtors long and short form buyer representation agreements. If you're conducting a non-agency showing, you should use a showing only agreement without representation. Texas Realtors has created a new form for this purpose, and it's called the Unrepresented Customer Showing Form, and that's TXR 1508. It's also important to note that if you start with a showing only agreement and the customer later wants you to provide additional brokerage services, you must enter into a separate buyer representation agreement. And then finally, let's discuss what the written agreement must include. Senate Bill 1968 and now TRILA require the agreement to clearly state the services to be provided by the license holder, the termination date of the agreement, whether the agreement is exclusive or non-exclusive, whether the license holder represents the buyer as the buyer's agent or does not represent the buyer as an agent when the only service being performed is non-agency showing. It must include the amount or rate of compensation the broker will receive, as well as how that amount is determined. And finally, the written agreement must include a conspicuous disclosure that broker compensation is not set by law and is fully negotiable. There's also two requirements that are specific to non-agency showings, and that is that the agreement must be non-exclusive and it must terminate within 14 days. As we continue reviewing these and other forms and contracts, I'm going to be pointing out specific changes you'll see in the updated forms that were made available in January. So let's talk more about the different agreements you can use to satisfy the written agreement requirement. You're likely already familiar with TXR 1501, the long form buyer tenant representation agreement. This form can be used when representing either a buyer or a tenant and it's no longer limited to residential transactions. So you'll see that the recent updates and changes to TXR 1501 include a new provision in paragraph 7 that allows the optional payment of a retainer to the broker. This is optional, it's not required, but it is now available if you want to use that. The residential has been removed from the title, so the form can be used in more types of transactions. There is a new definition of related party in paragraph 3. And then additional notice has been added in paragraph 18 regarding changes to Texas law after the passage of Senate Bill 17, and that affects certain foreign acquisitions of real property interests in Texas. It's important to remember that the notice in paragraph 18 is informational for the client. License holders should not provide legal advice about whether Senate Bill 17 applies to a specific client. Another option you are probably already familiar with is TXR 1507, and that is the short form buyer tenant representation agreement. So this form can be used when representing either a buyer or a tenant, and there haven't been any recent changes made to this form. I just want to point this out as an option to you for the written agreement requirement. And as you can see from this form, TXR 1507 is a simple one-page agreement, and it can be customized to fit your needs and the client's needs. For example, you fill in the term. It can be as short as 1 day. The agreement can cover full service representation or just showing a single property. And it can include a fee or no fee. But just know that this is a representation agreement and it can be used to fulfill that written agreement requirement. Finally, if there is no agency relationship that has been established and the written agreement is solely for the purpose of showing property without representation, under this new carve-out in the Texas law that I mentioned earlier, the agreement may be a showing only agreement without representation. Texas Realtors Form TXR 1508 that you see here is the unrepresented customer showing form. And this is a new form created specifically for non-agency showings. As you can see, it's short, one-page form, and it's limited for use in non-agency showing situations. So if your broker allows non-agency showings and the requirements that I mentioned earlier are met, you may use this form when showing property to an unrepresented customer. Before moving on to additional form changes, I do want to briefly talk about open houses. We have received many questions recently about open houses since the passage of Senate Bill 1968. So let's take a look at how the changes to agency law and the new written agreement requirement apply in that context. So hosting an open house involves showing residential property to potential buyers. So it's important to understand how these changes to TRILA affect you in this setting. If the agent hosting or the broker hosting the open house is part of the listing broker's office, so would be the listing broker or another sales agent at the same brokerage, the agent does not need to provide the IABS or enter into a written agreement with prospective buyers. The agent or the broker must also disclose that they represent the owner, either orally or in writing, as required by TRILA. Now, if the agent hosting the open house is not part of the listing broker's office, and so they do not represent the seller, so this would be a showing agent, the agent must provide the IABS and they must enter into a written agreement with all prospective buyers. So, in short, if you're not representing the seller, you're required to provide the IABS and enter into a written agreement to everyone who attends the open house. Now, I've mentioned the IABS a few times already, so before I move on to additional Texas Realtors forms and contract changes, I do want to talk briefly about updates that TREC has made to the IABS and a few other TREC forms. So let's get to that. As of January 1st, 2026, the new IABS 1-2 is now mandatory, and it replaces the IABS 1-1, which should no longer be used. Several important updates reflect changes to TRILA arising out of Senate Bill 1968, and you'll see that all references to subagency have been removed. There's a paragraph that explains when a written agreement is required with a prospective buyer, and a paragraph that explains how a license holder can show property without representing the buyer or tenant. And then also there's been some updates to the license holder contact information at the bottom. And amazingly, TREC has kept this on one page. So that is pretty wonderful. Next, there's a few other TREC forms that have been updated, and these include the landlord's floodplain and flood notice. This was actually updated back in November of 2025, but I just want to make you aware of that in case you didn't catch that. And the buyers and sellers temporary residential leases have been updated. The updated temporary residential leases became mandatory on January 5th, 2026. And just know that when TREC updates their forms, the form numbers change. So make sure you're using the most recent forms. The most recent forms are 15-7 and 16-7, and the older versions should no longer be used. TXR also provides these forms, and our numbers are 1910 and 1911. These have been updated and are now available for you to use. The reason for these changes is that updates in the law remove the requirement for landlords to provide the floodplain and flood notice for temporary or short-term leases. So as a result, these forms needed to reflect that change in the law. Okay, now let's talk about changes to Texas Realtors forms and contracts. Many of the updates I'm going to be discussing or have discussed arise out of changes in the law from this last legislative session and including Senate Bill 1968. Some additional changes came from feedback we received from members such as yourselves. So let's talk about some of those changes. First, we have updated the residential real estate listing agreement exclusive right to sell, and this is TXR 1101. The updates include removing reference to subagent in 5A, several non-substantive updates for consistency where we have capitalized some defined terms and updated references to paragraph numbers. And then we've also added the T47.1 declaration in section 19D as an addendum that sellers may need to provide. Next, we've updated the Farm and Ranch real estate listing agreement. This is a Farm and Ranch real estate listing agreement exclusive right to sell, TXR 1201. Similar to the changes we made to TXR 1101, these updates include removing reference to subagent in 5A and then some other non-substantive changes, such as capitalizing defined terms and updating paragraph reference numbers. So, not a lot of changes there, but with the changes in the law, this needed to be updated as well. The termination of buyer tenant representation agreement, which is TXR 1503, this has been updated to include the addition of language to emphasize that both parties must sign the termination agreement. Additional information has been added explaining the termination fee, and we've moved the protection period to its own paragraph, paragraph D, and we've added a definition of related party. And then we've also clarified that certain provisions in the representation agreement do survive termination. The General Information and Notice to Consumers, or TXR 1506, has been updated twice recently. You may recall that in September we revised both the title and the scope of the notice. It was previously called General Information and Notice to Buyers and Sellers. And since then, the form has been expanded, and this is at the request of license holders to apply not only to buyers and sellers, but also to tenants and landlords. Several changes were made at that time, so back in September, to better serve those groups. Since then, we have identified additional information that should be included in the form, and those updates are reflected in the current revision. The latest update adds provisions specific to tenants and landlords, and then it includes several non-substantive changes that were made solely to improve clarity throughout the document. There's a new form available for you to use now, and this is the Residential Contract Critical Date List, TXR 1958. This is an optional form, and it may be used to list many, but not all, of the important dates and deadlines from the residential 1 to 4 family contract. Just keep in mind that the dates for this new form are meant to be informational only. They do not change the contract. So, as always, it's important to verify the dates in the contract itself. There's a few other forms with minor changes that you're going to see here on this next slide. The condominium addendum TXR 1401 has updated the word unit throughout to property. The amendment to listing TXR 1404 has removed the reference to subagency. The information about on-site sewer facilities, TXR 1407, updated some information in paragraph D. That's just a reference that was in that in paragraph. The notice of withdrawal of offer, TXR 1945, just had some formatting changes to improve flow and clarity. And then finally, the HUD notice, buying your home, settlement costs, and helpful information, TXR 2512. We retired it as we realized it was no longer being utilized by license holders. Well, thank you so much for listening in today. I do hope that the information provided has been helpful to you. Please know that additional information and resources are available on our website, texasrealestate.com. You can find all of these updated forms on our website and additional information about changes that I discussed today and other legal updates that can help you in your profession. If you have questions, our legal hotline is also available Monday through Friday from 9 to 4, and that number is 512-480-8200. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you for tuning in.